Um, Welcome everybody. So happy that we get to be joining you here this morning. We're really appreciative of the opportunity to be part of the amazing workshops and webinars that I'm sure you've all been participants of over the past week. And yeah, well, I say we just dive right into it. We have a panel of four amazing women who are going to come and then just kind of share some of the experiences about how we're reimagining the workplace, given everything that's going on. And so I'm really excited to learn from them. So let me go ahead and introduce our four amazing panelists here. We have, all right. So first up, we have Kyla Hanaway Quinlan. Kyla works as Super Pedestrian's VP of People and Culture. She oversees strategic workforce planning, organizational development, hiring, and internal communications. Before joining Super Pedestrian, she scaled Zaxter, a fleet management company in the micro-mobility space, from 35 employees to a peak of over 500. Her side hustle is running a bakery down in Rhode Island called Beans and Buns, known for the biggest, best cinnamon buns around. So that's what we're all going after this panel. Is get us some cinnamon. Jen, I'm going to introduce you next. Here we go. Jen Rains-Loring, thanks for joining us this morning. Jen currently serves as the head of people at Postscripts, an SMS marketing company. Jen has a background in general management and operations and has focused her career on people operations once she realized that enabling high-performing people and organizations is her real passion. Most recently, Jen established and scaled people operations at a SaaS startup from 15 employees through successful acquisition by a public company. Jen specializes in people ops for remote-first, fully distributed teams. Jen, thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Dipti Solopek is head of people team at Snook, where she oversees all areas around people, culture, workplaces, and internal communications. Dipti has worked in the HR field her entire career, and especially in the last decade, focused on the tech startup space. In this role, believes that culture stewardship is paramount, and that the volatile environment of today presents opportunities for companies to put culture at their forefront and truly define themselves through their values and actions. And last but certainly not least, Amy Knapp. Since early this year, Amy has led the people function at Catalent, overseeing talent and people operations. She has been in the HR and talent space for over 20 years and thrives on partnering with companies and teams on building a meaningful employee experience. Prior to partnering with companies and prior to Catalent, she was working with tech companies through various stages of growth, as well as in the venture capital space, partnering with early stage founders on standing up their talent and people programs with their companies. So again, thank you all for being here and joining us today. I'm Alexander Noren, CEO of Forgent, an employee experience and leadership development platform. Again, just really excited to be here. And without further ado, let's jump into to our first question. All right, this question is going to be for everybody. It's going to kind of set a baseline here for our conversation today. It's very general, but let's have a quick talk on how, generally speaking, has the people ops landscape changed in the last 6 months? And Kyla, I'll give you the first stab at it.
Great. Thanks so much, Alexander, for the intro and for kicking it off. I think in my view, just a quick story. I actually, when COVID hit, I was due with my second daughter, and so was on maternity leave on starting March 16th, and a week later she arrived, and naturally, within a few hours of her being delivered, I was scrolling Instagram only to learn that about 80% of Zaxter's employees had been there was a reduction in force on that day that I hadn't known was coming. So I in a safe space between people ops people, I was somewhere between disappointed and a little annoyed that I hadn't been looped in on maternity leave, but I think it was very well intentioned. That's all just to say that I think pretty much everything in our space has changed, and I think that for our employees, their focuses are different than they were 6 months ago, and there's a lot going on in the world that our employees have to manage and have to think about, whether it's working parents or just being in the midst of what I view as kind of a revolution around systemic racism in our country, and I think that all of these things impact how how employees come to work and how they perceive their work. So what I've found has been even more critical than ever before is connecting the work to something more meaningful, and making sure that employees feel as though the work that they're contributing to is building community in the company, or is building community in some broader way in the world. And so that's kind of my take on how things have changed. I think even job security and employment, making sure that employees feel supported on a day-to-day basis feels more important than ever too. So acknowledging that, as people ops leaders, it's our job to clearly communicate and support our employees across the board in the companies that we're in.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Amy, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, so Kyla, I definitely agree with a lot of the things you said, and congratulations on having a baby this year. I can't imagine bringing new life into the world that 2020 has brought us. So more power to you. But yeah, I mean, I think even before this year, and definitely during this year, HR has always, in people operations, has always played such an integral and key position and a role in the employee experience, right? And I see it in my own journey. I started at Catalent in February, and 5 weeks later, everything changed. I had a picture about coming into this new role and developing a people roadmap on everything that we needed to roll out with regards to people programs and employee experience and the journey from, acquiring talent to keeping their talent. And all of a sudden it completely had to go away. And it was we have to move on a dime to go. We did a test remote day and a work from home day, and we never came back. And it was you all of a sudden have to shift into you're thrusted into the spotlight, which I believe HR should always be in the spotlight, and in many ways it is, but I don't think that anything has met its moment faster than people operations, this function in 2020. And to varying degrees, I mean, it depends on how your company was impacted, right? And how your industry was impacted. But certainly companies that have been navigating through a ton of change, whether it's, going through reduction in forces, or, you're dealing with a global pandemic, or political and societal unrest, and systemic racism, and mental and physical and emotional wellness. I mean, we're at the center of all that to try to navigate and lead the company through all this. So all of a sudden your focus changes, your priorities do shift. That people roadmap that you might come in and think about all these things you're going to roll out. They may not have gone away, but you have to think creatively about how do we actually roll it out in the appropriate manner, in the appropriate way, given everything else that is around us and surrounding us. And so I think that it's been a huge year for transformation for many companies, but for the people function. And I mean, you see that there are so many companies out there that are hiring new roles within the people function now, whether it is a remote work, manager, or just that, or just now companies are hiring more chief people officers now, more so this year than ever before, because I think that companies realize that they need this function more so than ever. So it's been really interesting.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's been a definite transformation and a renewed emphasis on the need, especially for having that employee experience. Jen, what are some of your thoughts? Last 6 months, what has it brought us that's really just been different and new?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me, everyone. And I'm sorry in advance. I let the panelists know I'm hopped up on decongestants, but # remote life. At least I can be on the panel, not make you all sick.
We're just happy you're here.
Bear
Sound great.
I'm coughing and things. But yeah, so I'm kind of just an interesting person to have on the panel in that I've been remote for several years now. So as I mentioned, or Alexander mentioned about me, I specialize in remote work and establishing people ops through remote lens. So in some ways, from my perspective, people ops hasn't changed as much from my own paradigm as it deals with company operations type of thing and people operations. But on the other hand, I think I can very much agree with things that Kyla and Amy said. And the way I've been thinking about it is I've reflected a lot on the operations part of people operations. And I think that's so key to remote work, but really it's the people part. I think as Kyla was saying, people are just going through so much and kind of needing to bring their whole selves to work, whether it's infant daughters or pets or, letting everyone see your house for the first time. Like, I really think people, as Kyler mentioned a lot, are just going through a lot. So I think for myself personally, re-emphasizing that people side of things, not that it ever wasn't important, I think it's taking on a completely broader spectrum of what people ops professionals really need to feel comfortable and handling and in ways to support employees. So I think that's a big change. And the other thing that I think I would just add on the people side of things, just being humane, I guess is why I'm saying that phrase, is really around recruiting and candidates. There are just so many talented people out of work right now, through truly no fault of their own. People who have a great career trajectory, and just, I think that's, for me, I felt a lot of obligation in people ops. Like, we really need to raise the bar on our recruiting mechanisms, and really candidate experience, I think, is another big part of it. Like, even small things, like we've tried at Postscript to take more time to really provide some feedback so people get something out of recruiting. It's hard to be declined anytime, and it's hard to be declined in this environment. So in addition to being better supporting people internally, I think being better at supporting candidates externally as well is something really been on my mind in terms of people ops changing in the last 6 months.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dipti, we'll have you round it out.
Yeah, sure. You know, instead of saying ditto, because everyone covered it so well, and I agree with everything. I agree so wholeheartedly with everything that was said. What I think is maybe we can turn the lens a little bit and say, what's happening in the landscape in the next 6 months? So we've had this really crappy and difficult year, right? But now what? And I just think like everyone's kind of teed this up perfectly to say companies are looking for the HR teams, for people teams to take on a larger leadership role, to influence more. And this is our opportunity. So I'm sure all of you have heard the buzzword of future work and what that means, what that looks like. But the truth is this landscape is going to be much more remote and much more distributed. And that doesn't mean doing the same work, but with your laptop from your bed. It's a different way of communicating. It's a different way of collaborating. You need managers with different skills. So you got to think about it from an organizational perspective on what do we need to actually operate if you're going to be more distributed going forward. And then the other thing that we have found in our company, you know, we were incredibly lucky, right? Like, so we weren't hit as badly by the economic downturn. And so because of that, we didn't have to spend a huge amount of time focusing on layoffs and stuff. We could regroup and say, we could just focus on the pandemic. We could deal with one problem instead of the multiplicity of multiple at the same time, I guess, right? Like, and that's as lucky as it gets in 2020. But one of the big challenges we had with everyone suddenly going distributed so quickly is this level of information overload. So all of a sudden, people are communicating asynchronously, and there's all this stuff happening in Slack that used to happen in corridor conversations. There's all this information that's being documented in wikis all over the place that people are sending links out of. We have this opportunity, and like, you know, if I ask our teams, they're like, I cannot find information anymore. I don't know whether to look in Seismic or Marketo or Slack or the wiki. Like, we use this one called Notion. Like, I just don't even know where information lives. And like, we as an HR team have this opportunity to create an information architecture environment. And it sounds IT-ish, but it isn't. It's about communication and collaboration. It's in the sweet spot of where we can take a leadership role. So when I look at the landscape, I'm like, distributed is going to mean a lot. Like, we will come out of this COVID thing. There will be a vaccine and there will be face masks, and maybe it takes 6 months, maybe it takes 8 months, maybe it takes 4, but we will be out of it. And then what? We have to start preparing for that landscape too. Like, we have such an opportunity in front of us.
And so just to follow up to that, what are some other things that we can concretely do to prepare for that? You know, as we sit here and we think, it almost feels like we've hit that kind of eye of the tornado. I feel like where the crazy rush, and we've all made this hard transition, and now we're in a good spot, temporary, permanent, whatever it may be. We're in this position where it's like, okay, we've got kind of got a handle on things. The lights are still on. We're still working. Okay, now is the time to prepare for, you know, what that future looks like. So what are some of your thoughts on specific things that we can do to help be more prepared for the 4, 6, 8, 12, who knows, timeline that we're looking at?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is I don't think the playbook's being written. I think everyone's figuring it out. So it's like, I can give you what we are doing, but that's not to say it's the best or anything. Sure. Like, I would love to hear from anyone else, you know? So what we are thinking through is how do we map out our population? If we believe the premise or the hypothesis, which we believe pretty strongly, that people are going to be more distributed, then how do we find what that will look like? So we've categorized people into 3 kind of categories. You're either post-COVID. You're either going to be in the office, which is you come in, I don't know, at least 3 days a week, or you're going to be flex, which means you want to drop in once in a while, or you're going to be full-time remote. You live out in Ohio and the office is in Boston and you're just working remotely, and that's cool too. But once we categorize people, then it's aligning compensation, then it's aligning benefits, then it's aligning which roles can exist everywhere. So it's an org design conversation. Then it's saying, all right, are managers equipped to deal with this, or do we need to provide an infusion of management training in a certain area? Same thing with recruiting. If we have a more distributed population, and we used to favor our hub offices, right? Like even though we didn't mandate it, we could hire people remotely. We favored hiring people in Boston, in London, in Tel Aviv, where we have big offices. Now, if we're saying actually distributed is fair game, how do we interview? Like, are we asking for something different? You know, and I was like speaking to someone in GitLab's team working on remote, and they're an exclusively remote distributed company. And I was asking them about remote and what it works. And the person said, like, the number one thing we learned is you have to start interviewing and testing for written skills, because so much collaboration is asynchronous and we don't do that in the interview process. Someone is charismatic, someone is expressive, someone is articulate in what they do. You're not necessarily checking how do they collaborate in writing asynchronously. And they were like, this was a differentiator for us. But the minute we realized it, we introduced it into our process, and that fundamentally changed how good we were at collaborating. So something like that. So to answer your question on what can you do now, I think be aware of it, start anticipating what might come your way as your company, and start putting in place some of these conversations, like who is thinking about how do we train managers? Who is thinking about, do we need to review our interview process? It doesn't mean you have to, it's just that surface those questions and have an owner to investigate it and start planning around it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And do you want to chime in?
Oh, no, I definitely want to chime in. Dipti, I can listen to you talk about this all the time. It's near and dear to my heart, and like I definitely think like we have surfaced it. Many companies may have this like a return to the office subgroup, or a task force, if you will, and we do, and we have surfaced this with our leadership team and with them in the past. We don't have things figured out because we're still navigating through a number of changes that we're going through right now, but it's so important to raise the questions on it isn't going to be the same way that work was before, at this company. And, we were very, very much of an in-person culture at Catalent, and in the office and FaceTime, and we are able to work successfully not being in the office all the time. So then it brings up the question about what is the purpose of the office now going forward? Many companies have made the decision we're going to get rid of all of our offices and just be full on remote and distribute it from here on out. We haven't made that decision, but it is surfaced on what if we end up being in a hybrid or flexible work situation, or remote optional, or remote first company? What does that look like for us? What do we, and then when you do that, like Dipti said, it's like thinking about how do all your practices and your work experience then fit into that, with comp, with benefits, with just, even if you do have a hybrid, being remote, everybody being distributed, your work experiences and relationships and how you run meetings is everyone's on a level playing field. But then what happens when you do become a hybrid situation where you have half the people in an office and half the people don't? So it actually forces you to think about how do our meetings get run? How do we enable our managers to have their one-on-ones? And how do we think about retention, engagement, morale? So it's a constant evolution. We certainly don't have that figured out at all, but it is, like Dipti said, it's very important to start bringing up the questions. So when we are ready when we're closer to understanding where we're going to be, we can start figuring it out, and we don't have to start from scratch at that point.
Yeah, just to add to this, I think it's such an interesting conversation. Amy and Dipti, you both have really fantastic perspectives on this. Where we are at Super Pedestrian is that some of we made a fundamental business decision when COVID hit, and it 3 months in to actually expand to Europe, and because what we do is we're scooter operators, right, and so we have to have a physical on the ground presence. And for us, the way that the curve was looking in Europe was kind of getting ahead of things. And it was, generally the infection rates were going down. So we made this decision to kind of expand globally in the midst of this, and then have had to start to put in the infrastructure to support European employees, while also building the infrastructure for U.S.-based employees. But where I was getting with this is that for us, there's always going to be a question of which employees need to be have a physical presence in a physical space, and which employees can be remote. So really being more intentional, during the scoping of roles, during the org development process, and figuring out, where do we get benefit from employees being, distributed versus where do we get it from employees being on the ground physically and having a presence, and whether that's connected to a certain hub or that's connected to a market where we're running our operations. And so we've started to build more infrastructure around this, and really, questioning assumptions that managers maybe have when they're making these decisions is, I think, a critical part of the people ops function right now too.
Alexandra, I was just quickly going to weigh in and agree with Kyla, the way her kind of final comments. The thing that I found in remote work is that remote at its core is on the spectrum of flexibility, right? Like, I think many companies are forced into remote right now. So it's kind of got specific connotations, but really it's on the spectrum of employee flexibility. And the trend is toward increased flexibility, right? And so I think I would just weigh in that when you're thinking about what your remote model might look like, your flexibility model, is it you're just lifting the constraints on location, to the comments about hub and are people going into an office sometime, or is it also timing, right? Because I think some companies go the furthest on the spectrum, and it's, to Dipti's point, about asynchronous work as well. So I think even within the remote bucket, there are various levels of flexibility that need to be thought through. And then to Dipti's point, people ops needs to align to make those things a reality.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I actually had a follow-up question to this for Kyla. Kyla, when we think about, we think about the employee of, so the employee of the past, right? When we were in a more traditional work environment. I guess for Jen, you've been working remotely forever, so maybe not quite in the same space. But what, at the individual level, how are the needs changing for an employee with regards to employee satisfaction, right? We have now a shift in priorities, perhaps balancing of personal life, being flexible and able to do that. But in your opinion, as we think about creating this optimal environment for our employees, whether that's remote, hybrid, or otherwise, what are some of those key elements that impact that individual employee satisfaction now, as opposed to what might have been more important to them, in the past?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think right now in this moment, right, taking away the future, but right now, one of the things that I found is really important is making time for joy in work, and really finding a way in our kind of regular cadence of meetings to make space for that, and to laugh and to have some kind of lightness in the work, and I think that the reason I think that that's really important is, again, this kind of overwhelmed feeling that I'm sensing from employees across the board. Some of that has to do with what's going on in the world. Some of that has to do with kind of where we are as a company. But I think that where we are as a company is that there's more work than there are people for it, as most startups have as an issue. But so, I think there's things that we're thinking in terms of, programming that's like a little bit more concrete. And then there's things that we're trying to, just start to weave into the culture, and to use Slack to find joy. And so some examples of this
Slack
type
to
of
find
programming
joy.
around.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, it's somewhat effective, I think. It's a little bit challenging, but I think that in the workday, we've tried to taking another kind of quick step back, Dagster, the company that I was working for, was acquired by Super Pedestrian, and so this all happened kind of as I was returning from maternity leave, and I came into a new company and building the HR function from the ground up. So that's just kind of background context there. But so I'm in a new company that hasn't had an HR team, and I haven't met anybody in person except for the CEO once for like an hour, right? I know a few people that came on via the acquisition, but otherwise it's a new team. So I had to learn what worked in their culture and what didn't work, and I'm definitely still learning this. But one of the things that was central at Super Pedestrian was that they all loved to cook together in the kitchen, and that this was, really, really, core. Everybody has an hour blocked for lunch in the middle of the day. So it's like, all right, we got to figure out a way to like tap into this remotely. We have to have some kind of like lunch gathering community. So we decided, and we haven't done it yet, but we decided that we were going to do a chopped competition virtually. And so things like this, I think, really, plug into finding ways to amplify the culture that existed with an in-person office, and doing that remotely, but also being mindful that like nobody wants to be a Zoom robot. So doing like a lot of fun things on Zoom can also be taxing in a different way. So, just finding the right balance there.
That's such an. Amy, actually, real quick, I want you to answer this next. So I'm going to add a little flavor to this because we had this really great question come in from the chat that I think is actually pertinent to what we're talking about. This concept of addressing the employee satisfaction. How do we do that when we have kind of different setups for our employees, right? So the question here that we got is, how do we keep groups connected and to build positive relationships when some have a physical presence, like a manufacturing, or others can work 100% from home? So kind of this, to further complicate things, right? Not everybody can be, some folks are going to have to be, in that physical environment, working in person, where others can be remote. How does that additional, factor play into keeping employees engaged, happy, and having a positive relationship?
Does anybody here on the call have anybody back in the office or have people working in a physical location? You do, Kyla, right?
I do, yeah. So we have a few different groups of employees that show up in person, and I would say that even though they're showing up in person, they're still distributed because of this issue of like social distancing. So I think that we're trying to find this thing. I think we're solving the same problems, which is like in a world where you can't get groups of employees necessarily together and do bonding events or foster that connection in person. Even though some of them are working in person, we're still not able to do that. Like we're doing pod scheduling and keeping employees kind of separate to reduce the safety issues associated with employees that are having to work in physical spaces. So I don't know that I have any better responses to that than anybody else on the panel. But I would say that keeping groups connected to me has a lot to do with internal communication. It has a lot to do with making sure that they all, understand what they're contributing to, and then understand what the interlocking functions in the team are, and just continuing to encourage through like cadence and things like that, internal meeting cadence, that they stay connected. And then there's like the social kind of more fun side. But I'll turn it over to one of the other panelists to talk about it.
Alexander, I'm happy as well.
Yeah, please, Jen. Yes, go ahead.
So we don't have anybody in offices because Postscript is fully remote. But in my last company, the SaaS company that I mentioned as part of the bio, one of my jobs as head of people was to lead our transition to remote several years ago. So we definitely had this situation where about 2/3 of the company was based in Boston, where the former headquarters were, and then we started to recruit really around the world eventually. But there was definitely an in-office versus out-office dynamic. And I think in what required a lot of iterations, frankly. The hybrid became really tough. There's just one learning, but in the event that your business model dictates a hybrid model, I think that remote becomes a mentality. Like if you're going to do remote well, you have to be remote first. So meaning we got to a point at my past company, even if people were co-located in a co-working space in Boston, everybody had to be on their computer individually to participate in the meeting, right? So subgroups and subcultures didn't form. Every meeting was recorded. So if you were in a different time zone and you couldn't make it, you could participate in many ways. People could submit questions in advance. And this goes to say, I think if remote becomes a mentality, and even if people are co-located, I would recommend should view things through the remote first lens to really make some of those hybrid models work.
Yeah, big plus one to Jen. We have found that even though we're technically all remote at the moment during this COVID period, a lot of our employees just like miss each other. So they congregate in WeWorks and stuff like that. So you get these groups of 5 or 6 happening all over the place, but they make it a point to each one dial in from their individual laptops, even when they're together. Like what's important is an even playing field for everyone to be able to participate. And that's how you get, like, you keep things inclusive, you keep a level of inclusion and a level of equivalence, I guess, in a collaboration.
Fantastic. So we've had a bit of a couple of hat tips to some of the technology that's helped us do this. I still think Slack could change that to their tagline. Slack will help you find joy. That's fantastic. What do you think? What is the role here of technology in helping enable this? Right. I mean, because there's definitely this notion of trying to replace in-person interactions, right, with a technology channel, right, video conferencing, whether it's Slack or if it's asynchronous, right, having folks communicating at different times. How do we keep that human nature in our communications, and how do we keep it personal if we have this technology? So what's that role there? And Amy, I'll kick that to you. Let you take a stab at that.
Yeah, I think in some ways, I think technology has been incredibly helpful, and we've talked about it. We have been, I feel, very successful in bringing joy through Slack as well this year. And I mean, we literally have a Slack channel called We've Got Spirit Despite Corona, and we have been very intentional and deliberate about what engagement activities we are doing in that. And we have, and it's optional to be in there, but almost the entire company is in that channel. And we do Throwback Thursdays, or we do a Gratitude Tuesday where we do shout outs of like thank you to other people, and that got the most engagement in these past few months, and it was just really heartfelt day seeing that. I think that we've done we had a Cattle and TV show where we did cattle and cribs, so people can show off their workspaces and their homes, as well as a Chopped as well. So trying to think about like ways that we can bring people together, but it has been really hard. I also think that technology has really hindered it, just made people more tired too. Like, somebody said to me last week, it's like we have to find ways to have more joy, but not over Zoom, and we're limited in that right now. So I think we have leaned in heavily to our managers. I did read somewhere that the team, the manager and employee relationship and within your own team is going to be really strong during this time period, but it's the inter-team relationship that will suffer this whole time. And I think that's the case a lot. There's not a lot of cross collaboration or cross community building. And so that's why we're trying to be intentional with all the communication that we're putting out there, either through email and through Slack. Zoom calls are hard. We do try to encourage people to, like, not everything has to be a video call. So like, we don't have to embrace all the technology that we can, but ensuring like we can take a step back and go for a walking meeting and have a phone call again, or in a safe way, go meet up with your team. Like, you have the permission to like get off the technology, right? And go ahead and have that in-person relationship and time with each other. But I think that, it is forcing us or it's bringing to the light, like, how do we think about what our, in HR, like what's our HR tech stack look like? How do we make sure that everything is the communication with candidates and the experience that they have coming in through an ATS versus, their onboarding? We've had to pivot that to being completely remote. So how do we embrace what technology solutions we have that makes that a seamless experience for folks? And that was a shift for us, not onboarding remote people before. And then just like internal communications is definitely like, how are we consistent? How are we like making sure that it's not only in Slack, but it's also in email, because searching for things in Slack is a pain in the butt when you're not there. So I think in some ways technology has really helped us, but we've also been cognizant of like, maybe it's okay to disconnect and try to figure out ways to creatively like get back to like not being so attached to our technology to build those relationships across the company.
I can jump in here. We've made a big investment in internal comms on technology that's focused on personalization and customization. And so what I mean by this, like if you think of remote onboarding, and I can see it's a question in the chat as well, so it's obviously very topical for all of us, right? So we've got a technology that integrates with our HRIS and our Slack, and we program things that get automated, like onboarding paths that get automated that new hires then get. So it reads, if you're a salesperson in Boston and you get a different onboarding path versus if you're a tech person in our Tel Aviv office and you need to know different things on your first few days. And it automatically reads, okay, so this person started on this day, so I'm going to give them this on day 2 of their joining and this on day 4 of their joining because they don't need it right in the beginning. And then I'm going to talk about values, but that's going to be in week 2 of their joining. So it like looks at where a person is based on their start date and automatically filters and drops in information that's relevant to them in their role and in their location at the time that they need it. And one of the coolest things with this technology, it's called PIN, by the way, PYN. One of the coolest things that it does is you can send things from other people in Slack. So the integration in Slack allows us to say, actually, you get this message at 9 a.m. on your first day from an HR person that says, hey, we're so excited to have you on board. And here's the 5 things that you need to think about this week. And like humans could not scale to do that at the rate that we were growing for all the different people. You just couldn't. So now we've programmed it, and it was a heavy lift to get all the programming into the tech, but now it's there. Now every single new joiner gets a ping at 9 a.m. on day 1 from their local HR person. That's a really warm welcome. And then they get a check-in 3 days later, a Slack from that comes from their HR person, but it's automated. And that to me is like where you can build in that personal touch, that human relationship, all of that, but you can automate some of it where humans just cannot scale to do what we would love to do in their perfect world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that scalability of making that process smooth yet customized for each employee. I mean, that's critical. And I mean, that's one big way that technology can absolutely help us. We had a question in the chat that I want to bit of a pivot here, but I think it's a really great question that's very relevant and top of mind for all of us. The last few months we've had a lot of external events happen that have helped us to refocus our diversity and inclusion efforts. Have helped at least bring to the forefront, hey, that this is not just an HR initiative that is nice to do when we can, but rather should be a real focus of our culture and our strategic mission inside our organizations. So I'd love to get some of your thoughts on this notion of how have our diversity and inclusion efforts changed over the past few months, and where are we on that landscape? Are we where we need to be? What do we need to do to improve more? How can we as organizations have that authentic focus on diversity and inclusion to help strengthen the culture of our organization, you know, in starting today and moving into the future? Jen, well, I'll pick on you to go first.
Sure, no problem. I am about 10 weeks into my new job, so I won't have a perfectly polished.
Perfect. That's great.
DEI plan. It's really important to post script. No, I think a couple of tactical things. We're working to implement the Walker rule in recruiting, which really promotes kind of a certain number of diverse candidates, making sure that people are really getting that fair shot, including in front of very senior leadership and hiring managers. And so a big part of it is recruiting to really change diversity, I think is a big part of it. And then I think we have gone through some helpful exercises around really, I think it's very easy to say DEI. And I think as a very operational person by background, what bums me out is that is vaguely ambitious. So, and it's very hard to operationalize things that are vaguely ambitious. So I think we've worked hard to really define what equity and inclusion, like these 3 things are separate concepts that really do need separate goals that we can operationalize a plan to achieve the goal. So I would say we've spent time defining those 3 things. And then something we're about to roll out, you guys are hearing it before the postscript team, but I think DEI belongs to everybody is the other thing. I think people really want to be involved. So people opposite postscript, we're about to kind of do voluntary kind of reporting back to the company on how our efforts are going against our goals as defined. And then have people kind of show up and say, here's what I'm seeing that isn't working. Here's what I want to try. Like really creating the environment that allows everybody to feel like they own DEI and have a very strong say in how we shape those efforts at the company. So getting everyone involved, I think, is a big piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Kyla, go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So I think for us having, this is foundational in my view. I think that what our company does is we serve communities with transportation alternatives, and in order to do that in a genuine and sincere way, our company needs to reflect the communities that we operate in. This is both like an HR initiative, but also really part of being a genuine presence in areas that we live in, and also understanding the intersection of race and transportation and housing in cities that we operate in is really critical. So to me, I think that right now our team is not doesn't currently reflect the demographics of the cities that we live in. Part of that is just I think what a lot of startups go through, which is like less than intentional recruiting practices over a long period of time. And so to me, this is like very critical that as we grow and scale our team, both a more like corporate workforce and our field employees who are on the ground and in the cities that we're operating in, that all of those are genuine reflections of cities that we work in. So, I think that there's a lot of ways to operationalize this, as Jen alluded to. I also think that there has to be a commitment to employee education, and so the path that I've taken is wanting to bring in some external speakers to talk specifically about the intersection of technology and race, technology and housing, and also race and kind of city planning as kind of understanding that historical context. So that's how we're viewing it right now. It's really important to employees. It's really important to me, and it's definitely on the whole leadership team's radar that we need to do this well, and not just because of what's happening in this country right now, but because we need to be a genuine presence.
Yeah, absolutely, and I love that notion that you just talked about, how we've got to, if you don't reflect the customer base that you're serving, you're gonna have it's gonna be a little bit harder to connect with them and to be able to to be able to be the best best service provider you can be for your customer in that regard. Let Amy or Deputy, if you guys want to chime in, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I will. I'll chime in. We at Catalent definitely have a lot of work to do and a lot of room to grow within our diversity and inclusion efforts. We did start this year, and to kind of piggyback on what Jen and Kyla were saying, it's a lot about education, and it's difficult to balance we have a very passionate workforce that they want action, and they want to like move forward, and they want to see results and goals and everything. And at first it's like, let's take a step back, because we don't also want it to be about a one moment this year. We really want to put really a lot of thought and attention into building it into the fabric of our company, and not have it be an HR-led initiative, having the support and the backing of absolutely driven by our leadership team, but driven by the company really. And so we did form an Inclusion and Diversity Council to take a step back, and it's a variety of employees across the company, well represented from different levels and different functions, and to really think about how can we operationalize some of the ideas that our company, our employee force has, and just starting to look at who our current demographic is. So we did a diversity survey just to understand like who makes up the employee force here, who do we have as they self-identify, and then we can really work on like, where are the gaps, because there are many. Where are those gaps? We are not hiring much this year. I think we have two positions right now. We'll see, as we continue to move forward, but it's actually a really great time to look at our recruiting process at that point, and we have the bandwidth to do that. So like, how do we make sure that we have a fair and equitable process? So when we do ramp up, and what goals and metrics can we put into that? And then thinking about the council has divided into, there's 3 different charters that we have where we're here to educate our company, the workforce. We're here to participate in events and community or with community organizations, and we're here to advocate for our employee force. So if there's anything that we need to look at internally as a company about like what our practices are, and we're making sure that whether it be recruiting or looking at promotion processes or management, best practices, are they fair and are they equitable? So we're very early in that, but it is something that we intend to put a lot more intention and thought into and hopefully over time we'll see our diversity numbers really shift if we are putting a number of intentional thought into it.
That's fantastic. And I love that emphasis on measuring, right? I think sometimes we get really excited about this maybe passion and energy that we have to do the right thing, right? But we got to take a step back and just say, okay, hold up. Let's make sure we're going in the right direction. That's fantastic. I'll let you finish us out here on this question.
Yeah. I mean, I really like measuring as well. At the end of the day, if you can't measure it, you don't know if you're progressing. Like, you need to be able to measure something. Mm-hmm. But I think if we overemphasize measuring, you're running this risk of just creating a quota system or resistance against a quota system. And so you want to be super careful. And we've spent time saying, yes, we have targets, but we're not going to focus on other than the executive team that looks at it, we're not going to focus our communications on our targets and our goals, but rather on the actions that need to change in order to achieve them. So a lot of our conversation is like, so for instance, we created this diversity pledge that we asked all of our hiring managers to take and sign up for. And it's super tactical. It's like, I'm going to make sure that there's a diverse slate of candidates before I make my choice. I'm going to make sure that the interviewer slate is diverse so that, we have multiple perspectives looking at candidates. So it's something really basic as that, but those are the actions that we force. And we found that just like everyone else was experiencing, there was demand for, hey, what are our goals? Like, where are we putting ourselves out there and how are we holding ourselves accountable? But we actually found that focusing on the actions resonated a lot because it gave people something tangible to do. Like, when you tell people we want to move from 10% underrepresented minority to 15%, they still like, how? The dots don't connect. And here we gave them something super tangible to work with. Same thing on the equity front. We do, every time we do a compensation review, which is every 6 months, we do a full gender equity, pay equity analysis. And before we start the comp review, if we have found, and because we do it every 6 months, we find that there isn't a gap. But where we find that even there might be small discrepancies because of, the hiring in the last 6 months, something's happened, it's created anomalies, we address that. So first thing we do is create an even playing field, and then we do comp review. But doing that it was a big conversation with the CFO and CEO. It's a big commitment, but we're really proud to do that and make sure that that's a part of our just ongoing process, But I'd say probably our biggest conversation and emphasis is on inclusion, because at the end of the day, you can hire a ton of people if you aren't bringing them into a company where they feel excited and equal and just included as a participant in the conversation. It kind of doesn't matter. Then it's just numbers. Mm-hmm. So like a lot of our conversation with external facilitators, all of that stuff. And inclusion is so many things, right? It certainly races at the forefront of people's minds today. But even outside that, we got in an external speaker. I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Kyla or Amy who said, you have to think about how do you run effective meetings in a new environment. We got in an external speaker who talked to our employees about how do you run effective meetings and how do you make them inclusive in a remote environment. So those kind of things, it's like, how do you pull introverts in? So it's more than race or gender. It is actually people from different backgrounds. When you have a person who has come in from a non-techie space into our world and isn't familiar with Slack, how do you not make them feel like crap about that? So those kinds of moments is what we really focus on to build that experience.
That's incredible. And I think, we've run out of time this morning, but I think that's a perfect place to end, because really at the end of the day, I think in our role here in people ops in general is really inclusion, right? Could be a definition that we use to describe what the whole purpose is of what we're doing, trying to bring our people together in a way that everyone feels that they can contribute meaningfully, that they feel like they're a respected, value add member of the team. And I think that's just absolutely a tremendous thought to end on. So everybody, thank you so much. To our attendees, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate you being here. To our 4 absolutely fantastic panelists, thank you for taking some time out of your very busy schedule to share some of your thoughts and insights with the group here. We really appreciate it. We hope you all have a very wonderful rest of your Startup Boston week, and we look forward to connecting again in the future.